So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Anil Seth, Professor Anil Seth, who is that rare breed of a brilliant scientist who is also able to communicate his ideas. I think it's safe to say that you've done that extremely well. I think one of the reasons why we've got a full house today is because you've done it so well. You've published a wonderful book called Being You, and you've given some talks that I think has really ignited the interest, or reignited really the interest in consciousness. Some of us for the longest time have been interested in consciousness, but we've all sort of been slightly demoralized by a guy called Chalmers, who said there are problems out there and they were not being solved. But I think what you've given us is a breath of new air. I think you've given us a different way of seeing on this, I think, essentially, probably certainly a hard problem, but certainly also an essential and necessary question to understand where we're going, what it's like being you. And so, of course, for the Center of Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing, it's fantastic that you have chosen to come and talk to us, because I know you're also a hard man to actually, because you're so in demand. So please, all of you, can we give Anil a hand, and please.
Thank you very much, Morten, for a very kind introduction. We shall see whether I'm any good to communicate it at all over the course of the next hour or so. But it's a really great pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to learn more about this centre. I know a bit about it, and it's an extremely wonderful venture. I'm very happy to see it exist, and also very pleased to be in Oxford. I was born in Oxford and grew up in Wantage, which is a slightly dismal town about 10 miles south of here. But Oxford was a sort of shining light, the city nearby. So it's always a pleasure to come back. And today I'm going to talk kind of relatively high level talk about the various areas of work that I've been involved in with my group at Sussex over the last few years, and including some colleagues here like Pedro, who's been involved in this as well. And so we can maybe dive down into some details later on. So it's going to be fairly high level. In fact, most of it's on this opening slide, which was very kindly sent to me. Somebody just made this slide, I think, having seen the TED talk, and sent me this summary of everything that was in it, which is basically right, apart from one typo of consciousness, which keeps really annoying me there. Anyhow, so it's kind of all on that. And the title of today's presentation is a bit mysterious, from beast machines to dream machines, and in fact takes a little while before we get to beast machines, but that made it an even more clumsy title. So we'll go with this. And but it's really a talk about a general approach to thinking about consciousness and what we might do as a kind of interdisciplinary cognitive neuroscience oriented group about understanding this big mystery. So consciousness. As always, when talking about a term for which a variety of opinions and attitudes exist, it's important to start with a definition. And I offer this definition not as the end point, but just as a way so you know what I mean when I say the word. I'm not necessarily expecting everybody to agree with this particular definition. In fact, it's not even my definition. It comes from Thomas Nagel. Let me see if I can move this around so it's less intrusive.
Maybe we can even get rid of
it. Seems to have gone. No, it's fine. Yeah, it's gone. It's all right. It's fine. It's moved. Oh, thank you. Perfect. The definition comes from Thomas Nagel, who was a very well-known philosopher of mind, who said an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. Very straightforward. I think what he means, or certainly what I take him to mean, and I think what a lot of others take him to mean, is that it feels like something to be a conscious organism. It feels like something to be me, to be any one of you. Non-human animals, certainly some of them, maybe not all of them, but it doesn't feel like anything to be this lectern or that chair or this laptop computer, probably. The fact of experiencing is going on for some systems and not other systems. The other thing I like about this definition is for what it doesn't say. I think often talking about consciousness, people make associations implicitly that then they get hamstrung with. So consciousness is not here the same thing as intelligence. It's not the same thing as agency or overt behavior. It's not the same thing as language. It's interestingly not the same thing as self-consciousness. So there's not an assumption here that conscious experience has to involve the explicit experience of being an individual that has conscious experiences. So it's just pure experiencing that's going on. So this, of course, came from his famous paper about, it's not working.
We need to focus on rings and drops.
It seems to have.
Just click on the slide. Maybe just click on the
okay,
slide.
yeah.
We've lost. Yeah.
There we go. There's the map. What is it like to be a bat? That was what was going to happen with better timing. But there it is anyway. So what is it like to be a bat? Of course, we will never know. But for the bat, there's probably something it's like to be a bat. David Chalmers has already been mentioned, so I take my usual little pop at him. He's a good friend, but I agree that his formulation of the hard problem of consciousness has been a bit challenging to know what to do in the face of it. So the big mystery then is how do we explain conscious experiences, the presence of experiencing for a system in terms of things happening in brains and bodies? And Chalmers' formulation of the hard problem is like this. He says it is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. So that's the hard problem. How and why should physical stuff of any sort give rise to or be identical to experience? Now, in the face of this, the intuition that Chalmers has here is that the hard problem can juxtapose with the so-called easy problems. And the easy problems are the problems for which there's no conceptual mystery that a solution might exist in terms of mechanisms. Like questions about the brain that involve function and behavior. That can involve consciousness too, but primarily are about function and behavior. You're asking, how does a complex mechanism give rise to such and such functional behavior? And Chalmers' intuition is that even at the end of neuroscience, when all these so-called easy problems are solved, we would still be totally in the dark about the hard problem. Its apparent intractability would remain as stark as it seems today, or seemed some time ago. So that's the challenge. And in the face of this problem, if you take the hard problem face value, then it's tempting to come up with some sort of quite radical evasions to it. We have panpsychism, the currently rather trendy idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, part of everything, somehow everywhere. Of course, if that's true, then you don't have to explain how it relates to brain activity in any particularly complicated way. So I'm not very convinced by panpsychism. It's not even wrong, which is a sort of famous dismissal of it. We can talk about that later. And the other, I think, more interesting position is illusionism. There's varieties of illusionism. And illusionism is generally taken to be the claim that consciousness doesn't really exist, with a caveat, at least not how we normally think of it. So you have some strong illusionists who will say that we're totally mistaken. There's no such special thing as consciousness. There's really only function and behavior. And when you explain all that stuff, there's nothing left. Daniel Dennett can sometimes seem to take a point of view like that. So once you've explained all the dispositions we have to do things, that's all there is. Then there are weaker versions of illusionism, which just, I think, I'm more sympathetic to, which just say, well, we might have some pre-existing ideas about what consciousness is that are constraining the ability of explanations to do their work. So if you think there are some special mental paint or qualia inside the brain somewhere that sort of emerge out of the buzz of neural activity, maybe that's not what consciousness is going to be all about. Signed out? Why have we signed out? Sign out on this one. So yes, some illusionists keep trying to persuade me that I'm an illusionist. So I'll leave you to be the judge of whether you think that is true or not at the end of it. I think it's like a powerful medicine. You take too much of it and you end up saying silly things like consciousness doesn't exist. But you take just enough and it might have a very salutary effect by challenging some of the assumptions we usually have. Is it all right?
Just hold on, I think something happened. You need to log in again, I think.
Is it not streaming?
It's streaming from here and there.
But is it streaming online?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. Good, we're all good. So instead of thinking about panpsychism or illusionism or facing the hard problem directly, my preferred approach, and it is to call the real problem. And this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's slightly to annoy David a little bit. And it's also not a particularly new idea. The basic idea is to accept that consciousness exists, so it's not an illusion. And then instead of trying to explain how and why it exists in the first place, to just describe its properties. So it's no longer one single big scary mystery. And then try and account for its various properties in terms of the resources that we have in neuroscience, physics, and math, and so on. So to put it a little more formally, a little more clearly, how can mechanisms and processes, how can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness? And these can be both functional, which are less controversial, like what can we do in virtue of being conscious, but also critically phenomenological. Like the experience of vision that we're all having right now is different in character from an emotional experience or an experience of agency or an olfactory experience. And you can describe what these different experiences are like and then try and explain those distinctions in terms of their underlying mechanisms. This is not the same thing as trying to say like why consciousness exists in the first place. And in science, at least from my fairly naive perspectives on philosophy of science, explanation, prediction, and to some extent control are the criteria that normally define a successful scientific account of a phenomenon. Not necessarily why is it there in the first place, but our ability to account for, explain, predict, and control the normal business of science. We somehow want more from an explanation of consciousness, and quite why that is, maybe we can discuss later, perhaps because it's ours. Now, this is neither the hard problem nor the easy problem. It's not the hard problem because it's not about explaining why consciousness is there in the first place. And it's not the easy problem because of this focus on phenomenology rather than merely function and behavior. Trying to explain the experiential aspects. It's not new, it inherits from many people have been doing this anyway without really putting a label to it. One label that has been used is neurophenomenology, an approach I was very inspired by for many years, pioneered by Francisco Varela in Chile. Again, the idea of bridging neuroscience with phenomenology. An easy way to think about this is instead of solving the hard problem head on, the idea is that progressively explaining, predicting, controlling properties ends up dissolving the hard problem. Maybe there'll be a little residue of mystery left at the end, maybe not, and it might just vanish in a puff of metaphysical smoke, who knows? We will see. Now, I'm wary of spending too long on this background, but there is a, where's it gone down? Sorry. I'm having trouble dealing with the time lag here. So anyway, there's an analogy for this, which may have come to mind already in the history of science, which is how scientists came to treat the mystery of life. The distinction between the living and the non-living. And of course, it wasn't that long ago that people thought this was an insoluble mystery with the resources of physics and chemistry, that there had to be something supernatural about life, an élan vital, a spark of life. This was the philosophy of vitalism, which actually was pretty still well regarded right up into the early 20th century. And of course, we didn't find the spark of life. We didn't need to find the spark of life. What biologists ended up doing was describing properties of living systems, homeostasis, reproduction, metabolism, explaining, predicting, being able to control those properties. And the hard problem of life wasn't solved, it was dissolved. And although there are many things we don't know about life, there's no longer a conceptual mystery that life is beyond the bounds of the scientific resources that we have. That's why that picture of the cell was there. Of course, you don't want to overextend this parallel. It's more for intuition than to say it's exact. One big difference between life and consciousness is that you can put a frog on a table and look at it and get objective shareable data, but you cannot put a conscious experience on a table and look at it. It is harder. Subjective experiences, of course, are private, subjective. And so our methods are indirect for getting the data about conscious experiences. That's a big difference. But is it fatal to the ability to pursue a science of consciousness? No, it just means it's harder, and there's a necessary indirectness in obtaining the data that constrain what we're trying to explain. Okay, so if life was addressed by distinguishing its properties, what are the properties of consciousness that we want to distinguish? Well, I tend to think of about three different categories, and these are heuristically suggested. They're not carving nature at its joints, but I think they're useful ways to think about the kinds of ways we can break down the problem of consciousness into different things. So level, how conscious we are broadly, what goes away under general anesthesia comes back again, what may go up in psychedelics, we will see. Content, when you're conscious of something, the sound of my voice now, the feeling of the chair behind you. And then a very important subset of content, which is self, the experience of being you, being me, being an individual. This is perhaps, for many people, the most important aspect of consciousness research, the most personal certainly. So I'm going to, in this talk, just rattle through a little bit about each of these different domains, again, at quite a high level. We'll start off with level. And the first thing to say here is that conscious level is not the same thing as physiological wakefulness. They normally correlate. This is a very famous plot from cutting off the names. But I promise all this is referenced, but for some reason the references are not being shown because the screen is slightly too small. This is a famous image from Stephen Loris from many years ago, showing that conscious level and wakefulness may usually correlate. So you can go from coma, general anesthesia, deep sleep, light sleep, etc. But importantly, you can come off the diagonal in both directions. So when you're dreaming, you're asleep, but you're having conscious experiences. We're all familiar with that. What we may not have personal experience of is off the diagonal this side, where you can be physiologically awake, but unconscious. So this is the definition of the vegetative state, or what's now sometimes called the unaware wakeful state, or the wakeful unaware state, and other conditions like sleepwalking and absence epilepsy. So it is possible to doubly dissociate consciousness from wakefulness. So what we want is something that correlates with conscious level in a explanatory way. So not just a correlation, but an explanatory bridge between mechanism and conscious level. And skipping a whole bunch of stuff, the one approach we've been working on in our lab in collaboration with people like Pedro for a long time now is the complexity of brain dynamics. And I'll come back to the why of that in a moment, but the broad why is that it's often been said that conscious experiences are complex. This was an insight that actually really appealed to me when I was finishing my PhD about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, from Gerald Edelman and Giulio Tononi. Really the precursor to integrated information theory was a paper in Science in the late 90s, making the point that every conscious experience we have is both highly informative, it's different from every other conscious experience we'll ever have, and also unified, bound together as a whole. And this balance of information and integration, differentiation and integration, as it was said at the time, is a hallmark of complexity. And so if conscious experiences are like that, then the underlying brain mechanisms dynamics should be like that too. So it's not just a correlation, it was a correlation that had explanatory value for what was argued to be a fundamental property of all conscious experiences, what we then called a structural property. So that was the motivation. And then moving ahead, how do you measure this? Well, a number of measures were proposed, but one of the more robust measures turns out to be this measure of Lempel-Ziv complexity, which, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of a compression algorithm with its origins in signal processing that, for instance, can compress a photo into a JPEG file. Very briefly, what these algorithms do is they look for the number of different patterns of different sizes that are present in the data and counts the library of distinct patterns that are needed to regenerate the data set. And that gives you a measure of the Lempel-Ziv complexity. or if you like, the diversity, the signal diversity of whatever it is that you're looking at. So it's kind of complexity here. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. It's a measure of diversity. A purely random sequence would be maximal on this measure. But nonetheless, it turns out to be quite a good indicator of conscious level. So going back to, when was this paper? This was like 10 years ago, 2015, not quite 10 years ago, with Michael Shartner and Adam Barrett at Sussex. We first looked at levels of complexity under anesthesia and showed that it goes down reliably as you lose consciousness under anesthesia. In sleep as well, this was on intracranial data from Marcello Massimini's lab, again showing that wakeful rest levels of complexity in 4 distinct lobes is higher than in early non-REM sleep, where dreams are likely to be absent. But what was interesting here particularly is that REM sleep, where people are having conscious experiences or more likely to, was basically the same as wakeful rest. So there's a nice empirical reflection here of the fact that wakefulness and consciousness dissociate. And then most recently, but already now a few years ago too, we looked, and I know a number of people here very interested in psychedelics. So back in 2016, I think, 17, we, in collaboration with the Imperial Group, we applied levels of complexity to MEG data under 3 different psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, and low-dose ketamine. And what was interesting here was that the levels of complexity reliably went up, which of course led to all sorts of annoying, expectedly annoying media headlines like "Scientists discover evidence for higher state of consciousness." And why do you need scientists to tell us that? We knew it anyway. That's not what we're saying. But higher signal diversity in psychedelics didn't make for such a good headline. I mean, this is interesting. It's like interesting to know what it means. I mean, you could think of the psychedelic experience as less complex in the sense of being more disordered. It's a little bit hand wavy, I think. Empirically, what was interesting, at least at this time, was we tried to find other situations where levels of complexity went up above the baseline of wakeful rest and hadn't found any at all. So this was the first time we found something, and it was very, very clear that it went up in that case, and it's since been, I think, that's been replicated a bunch of times. Just to dwell on psychedelics for a little bit, in a more recent study with Lionel Barnett down there in the corner, we were interested more in the patterns of functional connectivity in the psychedelic brain compared to the placebo. And in particular, we were interested in looking at Granger causality, which, for those of you who don't know that, it's a measure of information flow. You can have 2 time series, they could be 2 sources in the brain, and Granger causality is asking the question, does knowing the past of one help you predict the future of the other more than only knowing the past of the other? So what extra predictive information is present in a potential cause that suggests that it has an effect on something else? So it's a combination of temporal precedence and predictability, predictive information, which Lionel showed with me and Adam a while ago is theoretically equivalent to transfer entropy, if you know your information theory for Gaussian variables. But what we found here empirically was kind of interesting. We had no predictions, particularly what to find. Granger causality, both per source going in and out, reliably goes down in all the psychedelics, whereas correlation or mutual information more generally either stays the same or goes up. So this is kind of interesting. It's like a distinction between undirected functional connectivity, so simultaneous fluctuations in the time signals, and directed connectivity, where there's temporal asymmetry involved. And these things don't have to go anti-correlate in this way. Theoretically, they can be any particular relation. They're theoretically orthogonal, and indeed in practice, we wanted to look at something else, so we looked at we had the data for it from Suresh Kumaraswamy, tiagabine, which I think is just an anti-epileptic, it has no psychoactive properties. And in this case, everything goes up, correlation and information flow. So it's sort of empirically interesting that they go in different directions. And I think there's a sort of general lesson here that if we're looking at brain dynamics using these kinds of time series perspectives, then if you only look at correlation and not a directed measure, you may miss out really the picture of what's going on. And vice versa. If you just look at Granger causality, you might miss what's happening with correlation. It doesn't say which is important. It just says, if you make the claim directed or functional connectivity does X, and you're only looking at one or the other, then you might be painting an incomplete picture. Again, in terms of psychedelics, it might make sense. There's a bit hand-wavy. Psychedelic experiences a little bit more disorganized, perhaps freewheeling than non-psychedelic, than the baseline experiences. So less communication between different brain regions might be what you would expect to see. Now, just to move up to what we're doing in this area now, I mentioned that Lempel-Ziv complexity is a bit of a unsatisfactory measure of complexity. So what other kinds of measures might be we interested that might capture something global about brain dynamics that has explanatory value with respect to consciousness? There's a whole bunch of measures based on integrated information, which Pedro has collaborated with us as well and led a lot of that work, which I'm not going to talk about. But he's also working with us on measures of emergence. Emergence is, again, I find it fascinating because it's one of these terms that has a very checkered philosophical past as well. What does it really mean? Strong emergence, weak emergence? Is it a coherent topic? The intuition is stable, though. There's something about the whole that is more than the sum of the parts. Is that all in the eye of the observer, or is there something real about systems that have this property? Discuss. But the intuition is there, right? And especially you can see it. This is a very good intuition pump or intuition pimp. Surfers come up for a second, the surf will go away. Murmurations of starlings. This is the West Pit. This is the Palace Pier in Brighton, where I live. And when these starlings flock before roosting, there really does seem to be something autonomous about the flock itself. But it's also not at all mysterious that there are just birds flying around. We don't think there's anything spooky going on here. There isn't anything, but there's something about the flock that just shouts out, I am more than the sum of my parts. What is that? How do we measure it? Can we generalize from systems where it's intuitive to where it might not be? I think these are the sorts of questions that are worth addressing and then applying to consciousness, because a conscious experience too has this kind of property, right? That the experience we're having, any of us right now, seems to be more than the sum of whatever the neurons are doing. There's a globality and an autonomy and a coherence, a global coherence to conscious experiences. So there's a number of different approaches now to operationalizing this idea of emergence in a non-spooky way, so that we can look at systems and ask the question, is there a macro variable, like a large scale variable, like the center of the mass of the flock in that case, that is in some interesting way more than the sum of the things that make it up? Many approaches to this. I first wrote about it in 2010 using Granger causality, and then Lionel Barnett, still in the corner, my mathematician colleague, pointed out that what I was doing was hopelessly naive and came up with a much better way of doing it, which is called dynamical independence. The basic idea here is is really quite simple. This is currently in review in Physics Review E. If you have a bunch of microscopic variables, you can think of these as birds in the flock or neurons in the brain, and a single macroscopic variable, which could be potentially multivariate, have many different aspects to it. Dynamical, no, I'm not going to read out the math formalism, but the basic idea is that the macro variable, the flock, is dynamically independent if prediction of its future behavior is not improved by knowing what the parts do. Doesn't mean that the macro variable has to usefully predict its own future. It just means that no improvement is possible based on the parts. So you can just do as well as you can do looking at the macro itself. Of course, this can be a continuous quantity, because you can ask how well does a system depart from that criterion. So to what extent do the parts in fact help you, which is a measure of dynamical dependence. So the intuition is that a property is emergent to the extent that knowing what the parts do doesn't help you predict what the flock does, that the flock is sufficient. So Lionel was found a way to formalize and measure this. And the interesting thing about it, for me, is that you can apply it to systems where you don't know what the relevant macro variable is. So with the flock of birds, it's clear, right? We look at it, we see a flock, and we see, oh, that's a flock. Let me test whether it's emergent. But you might want to ask in the more general case, like you have a bunch of neurons that you're measuring with calcium imaging or something. Is there anything emergent going on there? Well, sure, you can tell maybe if they all flash in synchrony, but what else? Maybe they don't flock in a way that stands out to us. So we want a way of measuring emergence that's not reliant on our subjective intuitions. And this gives us one of that. We can calculate the emergence profile of a system across different levels of granularity that are based on this intuition. So that's something we're in the process of doing, and Lionel's worked out the theory, and we're applying it to data now. There are other equally interesting approaches to emergence that Pedro and Fernando Rosas and others have pioneered using partial information decompositions. We can talk about those later. So just to, again, reinforce why this is interesting for consciousness research is that they're kind of, I would call them interestingly weak measures of conscious level. We're not saying that this is identical to consciousness, like emergence is identical to consciousness. And in the same way that, well, people like Giulio Tononi would say that phi defined somehow is identical to consciousness. What we're saying here instead is that you can come up with measures that capture the intuition of emergence or complexity, that give you an explanatory correlation with the phenomenon, but you don't have to go all the way and make an identity relationship there. And this is a useful thing to do because the measures that are developed this way tend to be easier to use in practice because you make fewer assumptions. You don't have to measure, for instance, every state a system could be in, you only have to measure the state it's actually in, which is a hugely easier thing to do. So Pedro, Fernando, with me and Adam and Dan Bohr wrote this up in a comment on integrated information theory, this general approach recently, that there's the strength of weak approaches to these kinds of measures where we look for explanatory correlations, not identities. That's the paper there. Trends came out last year. Okay, I'm going to skip through this very, very quickly. One interesting thing that comes up from all of this, if we have a measure of conscious level that is predicated on brain dynamics, we can start asking questions about, are systems conscious, or do they display properties we associate with consciousness, even when they don't behave or are incapable of behavior? And I think this has some current application cases that in a paper with Michele Massimini and Tim Bain, we had this paper called, Are There Islands of Awareness? Are there systems out there already which are totally isolated from their environment, but nonetheless could be substrates for conscious experience? We talked about 3 cases. One was ex vivo pig brain. So there was this crazy Nature Medicine paper a few years ago where pigs who'd been dead for 4 hours had their brains removed and reanimated in some weird Heath Robinson-like contraption, and showed neural activity. They were given anesthetic just in case, but it was a very challenging paper because, again, it shows, like, hold on a minute, when does death really happen, or when is it irreversible? One could imagine applying measures of emergence or complexity to these ex vivo pig brains. Also, hemispherotomies, cortical hemispheres in humans that are completely disconnected from the rest of the brain for reasons of epilepsy. And I think most concerning, probably organoids. A lot of fuss these days about whether AI is going to become conscious. Less fuss about organoids because they don't talk to us like ChatGPT does. But they're made out of the same stuff. They're little mini brain-like structures that are made out of neurons. The whole argument about whether the substrate matters for consciousness goes away with organoids. Again, we can think of applying some of these measures. Okay, I'm going to move on because I'm taking too long. To content, having dealt with level. And the key idea here, and I think this is an idea that most of you will be familiar with, is that the brain is a prediction machine. When we try to understand conscious content, and this marks a pretty strict divide from the first part of the talk, so I'm not going to talk about how to put the complexity measures together with this idea, so don't try to do it. get confused. So the idea that what we consciously experience is the result of the brain's predictions about the causes of the sensory data that come into the brain. And this again is a very old idea, goes back to at least back to Plato and his allegory of the cave, where prisoners are chained to the wall of the cave, and they take the shadows playing. They see shadows cast by fire in the cave, and they take those shadows to be real because that's all they have access to. And now, updating that to the present day, instead of prisoners in a cave, you have your brain in a bony vault of a skull. And again, the brain does not have direct access to what's out there in the world or in here, in the body. All it has access to are noisy and ambiguous, colorless, soundless, odorless electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to whatever's out there. And the brain, faced with this, has to make sense of it somehow. And the idea of the brain as a prediction machine is that it does this by bringing to bear its prior predictions or expectations about the way the world is, or the body is, in order to come up with a best guess about what is likely to be out there, the most likely external or internal situation that would give rise to the sensory signals that are being encountered. Basically, the brain doing Bayesian inference on the causes of its sensory signals. Now, there's ample evidence that shows us that expectations the brain has do in practice affect our perception very deeply. I just show you one of them. This is a very famous rotating hollow face illusion. The idea here being that the brain has baked into its circuits very deeply over evolutionary history the knowledge that faces point outwards, not inwards. And this expectation is so strong that the brain would rather reach a conclusion of a face rotating simultaneously in two different directions than perceive an outward pointing face. I think this is quite striking. If you try it with a real rotating mask, it's even better, because when it's in its inverted thing, when you see it pointing out, when it's actually pointing in, it has this additional property that the eyes follow you around, which is fun to play with. So yes, the idea here is of course the Bayesian brain, that perception, action, cognition is all a process of the brain updating its beliefs about what's going on prior to the posterior, given new information, given the likelihood out there. Now, in psychology, probably the first person to propose that this was what was going on in perception was the German physiologist, physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, and this is now developed into the sort of schema of predictive processing, which is, I think, what we're most familiar with now in cognitive neuroscience. And the idea of predictive processing is that Bayesian inference, full-fledged, is intractable for systems like brains to do, so it has to do some kind of approximation to this process. And one way of approximating Bayesian inference is prediction error minimization, the idea that the brain is continuously throwing out from the inside out, blue arrows, predictions about either sensory signals or the activity of neurons in some layer below in a hierarchical system. And then sensory signals, or more generally the feed-forward bottom-up signal, constitutes prediction error, reporting the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of processing. And then perception becomes just this continual process of prediction error minimization. And what we perceive then becomes not some readout of the bottom-up sensory signal, but the joint content of all the top-down predictions that are continuously calibrated by the bottom-up sensory prediction errors. And this is nice because it's a process theory. You can actually build it. You can get mechanisms to do it. Conceptually, I think it's interesting because it really deviates from certainly old textbook ideas of how perception works, which is always some variety on the theme of bottom-up readout of what's out there. And this is a classic picture of the visual system of a monkey, from retina all the way through visual cortex, then for a temporal cortex. And the intuition is that simple features are processed at early stages and complex features at later stages. But however it's done, the heavy lifting is done in the bottom-up direction, and perception is a process of extracting information from the world, reading it out in this outside-in direction. Predictive processing changes this around, so that instead of the content of what we perceive being conveyed by the signals that are being read out from the world, perceptual content is conveyed by the top-down predictions, with the bottom-up sensory signals conveying prediction errors. And I think it is really worth, I keep coming back in my own mind to this point, because it doesn't seem like this. Like, the phenomenology of perception seems like the world is out there and we read it in. It doesn't seem like it's being generated from the inside out, or at least it doesn't seem like it seems like that. So that's I think the interesting conceptual distinction. Of course, things can get more complicated than that too. Just to give you again a hint of one of the things that we're working on, this is with Chris Buckley and Alec Chance and Baron Millage, this idea of hybrid predictive coding. You can extend the basic predictive coding architecture so that now predictions and prediction errors flow in both directions. So this is traditional bottom-up, predictive top-down, hybrid both directions. Why might you do this? Well, if you think about the situation that most organisms face, some things are relatively stable in our perceptual lives, indeed in our ancestors' lives as well. Other things are different and need to be inferred on the fly. And there's a technique in machine learning called amortization, where when things are regular, when environments are stable, a system can basically learn the optimal Bayesian posterior as a feed-forward function. And then only when things are uncertain does it engage in costly iterative inference to really exchange predictions and prediction errors and come up with a sort of bespoke best guess for that circumstance. And Alec and Baron and Chris, they're machine learning people first and foremost, developed this algorithm in machine learning and showed that it works really well on some standard problems in machine learning, so that it automatically finds a balance between when inference has to be learned or done on the fly. And the next step, and this is something we haven't done yet, is to think about how this might be useful when thinking about phenomenology. And one idea that I'd be interested in any thoughts people here have about it is, in vision, we have a classic distinction is between gist perception, where we immediately are aware of an overall scene context, and then detailed perception, where we recognize individual faces and objects. And these things have different time courses. People like Simon Thorpe have been working on this for ages, right? They can recognize scenes and overall things very quickly. The details take longer. And they have a different kind of phenomenology too, the details versus the overall. So the idea is fairly obvious that maybe when we experience gist or scene, it's to do with learned bottom-up amortized predictions, and then the details are to do with the finer grained iterative inferences. Now, predictive processing is not, at least in my hands, is not a theory of consciousness. I think this is really important. There's a lot of debate now about what is a theory of consciousness. And I say it's not a theory of consciousness because the theory of consciousness really should at some point explain why a system is conscious and why another one is not. And predictive processing doesn't really do that. It's a general theory of perception and action and cognition. What it does do, it can be used to explain properties of phenomenology in terms of underlying mechanisms. It's a theory for consciousness science, not a theory of consciousness. So there's Tim Bain and I wrote a review last year about theories of consciousness, making exactly this point and putting predictive processing in a comparison with other theories of consciousness, like global workspace, higher order, and integrated information. So I've given you, I've hinted with the hybrid predictive coding how that might work, but there are some things we can do in practice as well. This is a very simple experiment just to illustrate what this approach might look like. With Yair Pinto some years ago again, one thing you might expect to happen if what we consciously perceive is dependent on the brain's top-down predictions is that when there's a match between prediction and the data, we will see things more quickly and more accurately. There's less discrepancy between the prediction and the prediction error. So we tested this in one way using this continuous flash suppression, where we show a image to one eye, which gradually ramps up in contrast, and some changing blobs to the other eye, which gradually ramp down in contrast. We have a cue, which is, let's say, 75% accurate. So sometimes it aligns, sometimes it doesn't. And we ask the question, how accurate and how quickly does the image break through into conscious perception dependent on the cue? And what we find across a number of experiments reading out all sorts of things is that when the cue is valid, the person consciously sees the image both more quickly and more accurately than when the cue is invalid. So you see what you expect to see rather than what you don't expect to see. So in public talks, I often say that we're used to saying, I'll believe it when I see it, but we should say, I'll see it when I believe it. And we can also ask what would happen if we mess around with this balance between top-down prediction and bottom-up prediction error. In everyday experience, we're already familiar with examples of seeing faces in clouds, for instance. The general phenomenon is pareidolia, seeing patterns in things, in clouds or in the windows on buildings and things like that. But we've also been interested in, can we get a bit more fine-grained about this? Can we use computational models based on prediction to understand altered aspects of conscious phenomenology? And so in one initial study, we took a standard neural network. This is an AlexNet, it's very good at recognizing objects and images. If you run it backwards, which was originally done by Google Deep Dream, then you can basically say to the network, there is a dog there, now update the image so that it's compatible with the prediction of dog. It's a ham-fisted way of enforcing a top-down prediction on the sensory data. And when we did this, this was quite a while ago, you've probably seen this. This was a movie taken at Sussex. It's a bit jerky because it's going away, don't know where it's going. But we took every frame of a panoramic movie, ran it through this process where we're projecting dog, did some continuity. People would put a headset on and look around, and they would inhabit this slightly psychedelic version of Sussex campus where there are dogs coming out of every possible part of the scene. And the interesting thing here is that it's a model not of a particular behavior, it's a model of an experience. Right? And I'm not claiming it's any particular experience here, it's just that it's not. But what it's doing is making a model of phenomenology, not of reaction time or of metacognition or something like that, or of some function associated with consciousness. A model of phenomenology, a really crappy one, but nonetheless it's a starting point. And what we're doing now is using a different architecture which couples a discriminative network, much like AlexNet, with a generative network, which is capable of generating simulated sensory data corresponding to a prior. These can be coupled in various ways. This is with David Schwartzman and Keisuke Suzuki. And we're using them to now try to explicitly model different kinds of visual hallucinations that come up in neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease, where people have complex hallucinations that have sort of subjective realism to them. But that can also be spontaneous, like they don't seem to come out of any other part of the sensory environment. Complex and simple hallucinations from visual loss and things like Charles-Bonnet syndrome, as well as psychedelic hallucinations, which can be both simple with patterns and geometries and complex scenes as well, but which are mainly non-spontaneous. They often transformations of some existing visual input. And so without going into the details, what we do is we parameterize that network in different ways to try and simulate these different types of hallucination. And then we run them on some sample images. Here are just some sample input images. For visual loss, we have some simulated blur in the center. And then these images transform in various ways according to the network parameterization that we're using to come up with sort of modeled hallucinatory versions of each image. And you can say, okay, fair enough. But then what we do is we go back to people who have these different kinds of hallucinations, so people with Parkinson's or Lewy body dementia or Charles-Bonnet, or who have taken psychedelics in the past. And we give them different sample model output from the different parameterizations, we ask them which is most reflective of their lived experience of hallucinations. And they pick the ones, this is still being written up, so they pick the ones which are aligned with the ones that we would predict them to be. So our model of Parkinson's people, they pick the output of the model that we've tuned to be representative of Parkinson's. So I think this is kind of interesting because it closes the loop a little bit. We're trying to model phenomenology, and then we validate it against people's lived experience of that phenomenology. And that gives us an insight into what the computational mechanisms are that underlie that kind of altered experience. So this is the direction that we want to take this kind of work in. Okay, to put it all in a slogan, hallucination is uncontrolled perception, and so perception is a kind of controlled hallucination. Okay, last bit, and then I'm going to stop. Self. Self is not the thing that does the perceiving. Might be a sort of, as first superficially, might be the way one might think of it. There's a self inside the head, it does the perceiving. Rather, the case, I think, not a new case that I want to make, is that both the world and the self are forms of perception, are forms of controlled hallucination. And of course, there are many different aspects of being a self. There's the bodily self, the perspectival self, the volitional self, the narrative self, social self, having a body, seeing the world from a point of view, agency. And only then, narrative and social, do we have those aspects of selfhood that are associated with explicit self-awareness, that I know I'm an individual, I'm Anil Seth, I have memories, plans for the future, a network of friends and colleagues and so on. I'll focus on the bodily self and again explore just this idea that what we experience as being the body is not directly given to the brain. It's something that needs to be inferred at every moment through the same basic principle of prediction error minimization. There's a classic demonstration of the malleability of the experience of body ownership, of what is the body. I'm sure you're probably all familiar with the wonderful rubber hand illusion. Everybody familiar with the rubber hand illusion? Yes, pretty much everybody. I'm going to show the video once again. The idea here, well, the standard explanation of the rubber hand illusion is that the guy in blue, he's seeing the fake hand, he's feeling he's feeling the brushstrokes of the fake hand, and so his brain basically puts these together in this sort of multisensory integration. Like, okay, there's, I'm looking at, it doesn't look like my hand, but it looks like a hand. It's roughly where a hand should be, and I can see it being touched, and I can feel touch. So my best guess is that it's my hand. It's a nice story. It's a story I'm responsible for spreading probably more disinformation about than most people, because I gave it in the TED Talk, and I've come to think it's now wrong, or at least highly incomplete. That's what's going on in the rubber hand illusion. And the reason that I think it's highly incomplete, slight sidebar here, but it fits into the overall theme of the talk, is due to work by my colleague, postdoc Pete Lush. And he was interested in the variability with which people experience the rubber hand illusion. Some people are very, very compelled by it. Other people barely at all. Nobody, by the way, thinks it's actually their hand. Yeah. Whereas in some clinical conditions, we have those phenomena, things like somatoparaphrenia. People can be convinced and not only perceive their body to be different, they can be convinced of their aberrant perception. But Pete was interested in this variability among the non-clinical population and tested the rubber hand illusion on over 300 people at Sussex, this rubber hand factory, which was going for a week, and found out that, so we measured subjective response and also a so-called objective measure, which is where do you think your hand is? Does it drift? The idea is if you experience the illusion strongly, you mislocate your real hand more towards the fake hand. Also measured hypnotizability or imaginative suggestibility, which is a stable psychological trait we all have. And what he found was a pretty strong correlation between strength of illusion and suggestibility. And this is kind of interesting because if you think about the rubber hand illusion, it's riven with demand characteristics, as psychologists used to say back in the day. You're strongly implicitly encouraged to have a particular kind of experience in the rubber hand illusion. This is, again, just showing hypnotizability, the correlation. But again, there's always a big difference between synchronous stroking and asynchronous stroking, which is supposed to be the control. If you stroke them out of time, people don't experience it. But we also asked people what they would expect to experience, and it's exactly the same as what they do experience. So you put these things together, the rubber hand illusion might well be driven by demand characteristics. People expect to experience a certain thing because of the experimental setup, and to the extent they're suggestible, they do experience it. So the correlation with hypnotizability is a sign that some demand characteristics are going on here. In a predictive processing story, it simply means that your experience is being driven by a top-down expectation that you're not aware of having. It's coming through the experiment via demand characteristics. And so I think this is something we're now worrying about quite a lot, because it seems like the need to control for demand characteristics, which was very, very much discussed decades ago, has been forgotten by quite a lot of people and should be remembered. You have to control for them to make claims about other mechanisms. We've now been extending this just by the way to other things like ASMR, ASMR, where people feel nice feelings when watching people fold handkerchiefs or fold paper. The jumping pylon that famously some people hear as thudding when it hits the ground, visually evoked auditory responses. Both correlate with suggestibility, as do other things. But things like the Müller-Lyer illusion do not. So it's not a kind of something that applies to everything. There's interesting distinctions between what's cognitively penetrable in that sense and what isn't. Okay, coming to the end. Talked about having a body, but of course there's also this being a body, this experience we have of being a living organism, the body from within, which is what this whole territory of interoception is all about, this sense of the body from the inside. Now, a lot of the brain is dedicated towards sensing, perceiving, regulating the body from within, because if you think about it, that's what brains are fundamentally for keeping the body alive. Everything else is extra bonus. But the body from within is also not directly accessible to the brain. So an argument I've been making for 10 years now is that there's likely to be just the same kind of essential process of inference going on, but now unfolding purely within the body, a kind of interoceptive inference by which the brain is making predictions about the causes of sensory signals coming from the inside. But there's a key distinction here. This is all sort of speculative, no direct evidence for this, which is that for interoception, these predictions are less about finding out what's there and more about controlling and regulating what's there. There's a longer story here to be told about how prediction enables control. And in fact, that's another reason why perception might operate this way in the first place, not just as an approximation to Bayesian inference, but because essentially perception was in the business of control, and having a predictive model of a system is a very, very good way of being able to control that system. Because you can basically predict what it's going to do in the face of perturbations. When it comes to the interoception, the brain doesn't really care where the internal organs are or what shape they are. It cares about how well they're doing at keeping the blood pressure within the range it's supposed to be, keeping things within that sort of allostatically viable range. Whereas predictions of the world on the outside for first approximation are about figuring out what's there, where's it going, is it coming towards me, is it going to eat me? Different kind of prediction. Now, this idea of predictions control is motivated by a lot of things, which I'm just going to mention. Active inference, Carl Friston's extension of predictive coding, where we can minimize prediction errors by acting as well as by updating predictions. There's another whole rich line of thought in cybernetics. Ross Ashby talked about, in fact, every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system, although apparently his maths was rather flawed, making this point. And then, of course, Carl Friston's free energy principle, which everybody understands transparently, I'm sure. Organisms must maintain themselves in the states they statistically expect to be in the long run. Now, all of these point to the same basic direction, that the fundamental role of brains is regulation and control of their organism basis, and that having generative predictive models is a good way of doing this. And I'm going to leave that there without further justification, but just point out its implications for consciousness. Because if predictions are about what's out there and where things are, well, then it's no surprise that visual experiences have the character that they do. Objects with spaces between them and so on. And actually some work I'm not talking about today, we looked at how to explain the objectness of visual perception, the fact that visual objects have a back, even if we can't directly see the back, because we can make predictions about how visual signals will respond to actions. But interoceptive predictions are not like that. They're about control and regulation, and they underpin embodied experiences. And if you think about what an embodied experience is, it's an emotion, a mood, a sense of being alive relatively to some extent. Embodied experience have valence. Everything is a variation on good or bad, or likely to be good or bad in the future. And that makes sense in terms of what the functional role of the predictions are. So this is really just the start of the story of how different kinds of predictions can explain different kinds of consciousness. More general message here, and this is not something I expected to end up with when thinking about this years ago, is that this imperative for prediction goes all the way down in living systems. There's no obvious place where one separates the mindware from the wetware in a brain as one separates the hardware from the software in a computer. Even single cells self-regulate, generate the components they need to keep persisting over time. And so this whole perspective of perceptual mechanisms being based in this fundamental imperative to stay alive really ties consciousness much closer to our nature as living organisms than other perspectives on consciousness do that associate it with some form of information processing. And I think this is for me, it's reassuring. It shouldn't be attractive because it's reassuring, but it's reassuring anyway. And it marks a sharp divide. There's always have to mention Descartes in the talk about consciousness. One of the things Descartes said, although it's not clear that he believed it, was with respect to other animals, without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. Call them beast machines, bet machine. The idea that their flesh and blood status didn't give them any particular qualification to be conscious. In fact, it was irrelevant to the status of an organism as having the rational kind of conscious experiences that Descartes thought were morally important. Now, my perspective is almost entirely the opposite. That if all of our perceptual experiences are grounded in prediction, and if the reason we have this predictive circuitry in the first place is to regulate and control our bodies to stay alive, well then, we perceive the world around us and the self within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. So we are conscious because we are beast machines, not in spite of that fact. So just to sum up, the case I've been making is that we perceive the world around us through the brain throwing out predictions and updating those predictions with sensory data. This applies to the body as an object in the world, but it also applies to the body from within. And the key point here is that predictions of the body from within are about control and regulation. Okay, 2 minutes if I can to do implications, and then I'll stop because I'm over time already. One is that we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. We all have different brains, so we will all have different experiences, even though we don't normally realize it because we gloss over it with language, and it seems to us that we see the world as it really is. So even though we know we differ on the outside in skin color and height and so on, we also differ on the inside, but we only really notice this when the differences become extreme and we throw a label on it, neurodivergent condition of one sort or another. We miss all the normal variation because it's hidden in a common language. And because experience has the character of revealing the world as it is. Sometimes we realize this isn't true. Half the world see this blue and black. Let's take a quick poll. Blue and black, white and gold. Not many, okay. Yeah. I've noticed the frequency of white and gold has seemed to get less over time. The reason I mentioned this, there's a call to action here. So we have a new project going on since last summer called the Perception Census. And it's a kind of large-scale attempt to measure this inner perceptual diversity, not at the extremes of neurodivergent conditions, but in the normative range. I think we labor under this misapprehension. There's one neurotypical way and then other neurodivergent ways. But just as in height and etc., It's going to be some kind of curve. We want to know what that curve looks like. There's very little on that. There's studies of individual difference that look at different aspects of perception, but not many aspects in the round. So we have this project, Perception Census dreammachine.world. It's looking at 10 different aspects of perception. There's 9 here: sound, music, time, body, expectations, imagination, vision, color, other aspects of perception and boundaries. Lots of different things. There's altogether, I think, about 100 or more different questionnaires and interactive illusions in this survey. And they're all designed to be fun, accessible, easy to use. So for the general public, but also for you guys as well. We've already had people, more than 20,000 people have already taken part, doing more than 50,000 hours of tasks for us, of psychophysical tasks, from 100 different countries at least so far. So we're trying to be very ambitious here and make this by far the biggest study of its kind ever, trying to get up to 60, 70,000 people if we can, who are not just filling in a questionnaire, but doing experiments. And then we can look at all kinds of differences across cultures and languages and so on as well. Big team doing it. Obviously, it all came out of this other thing, which I'll just leave a teaser with, did anybody get to see the Dream Machine? A few of you. Okay, so I always want to talk more about this, but I never leave myself any time. The perception census is part of this project called Dream Machine, which I was involved with last year as the lead scientist, where we took this old invention by Brian Geisen of a flashing light, which if you experience bright strobe light with your eyes closed, you will have visual hallucinations. Almost everybody does. Almost everybody. William Gray Walter discovered this, was the first neuroscientist to work seriously on this film. Goes way back in history. A chapter in his book, The Living Brain, is called Revelation by Flicker, which is a beautiful chapter. Back in 1953, he was writing about this, realizing how flashing lights synchronized with alpha in the visual brain gave you interesting experiences. We've been working on this in my lab with David Schwartzman for 10 years or so now. But then last year, we collaborated with musicians like John Hopkins and architects like Assemble to Dev Joshi, the engineer at the end, to bring this to the general public again, but to do it collectively. So now we built these Dream Machine systems where up to 30 people at a time go into a space, lie down in these kind of business class seats with speakers on either side of them. We have like 32 channels and 84 speakers to give a sonic component to it. Flash white flickering light only at them. That's a Dream Machine from the outside. This was in Belfast in a church. This is in Edinburgh in the ice rink during the summer. And for a certain amount of time, about half an hour, people have visual experience, very powerful visual and emotional experiences too. And relevant to your center, uniformly positive experiences. So this is a sample of 2,000 people. We've had 30,000 altogether. That's peaceful. So the most common emotion reported was peacefulness, then awe, then safety, then euphoria. Generally good things. And very few bad things have been reported. And they also draw pictures of what we're collecting a lot of systematic data, which we haven't analyzed yet, but we have started to look at these pictures. People love to draw what they experience. And I want to leave you just with a selection of what they came up with. This was one picture, another. And we've got, I think, about 20,000 of these pictures now from different people. So that's the Dream Machine. It's a fascinating experiment to consciousness because you're just giving people flashing white light. Their eyes are closed, yet they're having experiences of all different kinds. Everybody has a different experience. And it seems to have a very positive therapeutic effect. So with David Schwartzman now, we're planning some studies to actually test the effect of this for reactive and seasonal depression. So there's some practical application to consciousness research as well. Thank you for bearing with my overly long, rambly talk. And I'll stop there with the obligatory advert for the book, which is on sale down the road in Blackwell. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anil. This was spectacular, I think. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I certainly have some questions, but maybe we should take some questions from the audience as well. And maybe you could check if there's some online. Yeah, that would be great. We start over there.
This is so exciting for so many reasons, but when I was a baby undergrad, I did a talk which was literally called Believing is Seeing, and it was all about belief-driven perception, and it was based on my experience recovering from anorexia and how the more weight that I gained, the thinner I appeared. And so that really got me thinking about the constructed nature of perception and the circumstances in which there would be that perceptual breakdown from a bottom-up perspective. But it's been a long time since I've been doing neuroscience. I'm now more into public health sphere, and so forgive my ignorance, but this is still coming a little bit across as ghost in the machine in terms of what could possibly be. I think it reminds me a bit of like grandma style, like Mexican style. What is it that's doing that referee role in terms of detecting residual between, I can imagine a neuron responding, and then, but what is it which is happening that, oh, that was incorrect, and that needs to be reweighted, recalibrated, re-updated. And what is it that's giving that detection of a residual balance? Because there are all of these circumstances where there's clear dominant information saying that there's been a prediction error. So for example, body dysmorphia, or even depression in terms of a positive signal being interpreted as negative. So what is it physiologically that's doing all of this? Because at a nuts and bolts level, I still can't grasp.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. I mean, and it's also part of the work is to unpack these mechanisms in a way that doesn't fall foul of sort of homuncular fallacies. I don't think it needs to do that at all. So just to take them in slightly reverse order. So what gives prediction errors salience? There's two ways to think about that. The most normal way to answer that is in terms of attention. So in any predictive coding system where you've always got some sensory signals coming in, no prediction is ever perfect, but how much does the system take those on board in updating its predictions? And so there was one picture where prediction errors, they're usually represented as a distribution, which has a sharpness. And so the system is always weighting prediction errors according to their estimated reliability with respect to something or other. And so they're always described by a mean and a precision. So the precision would be the sort of sharpness, how much a sensory signal is likely to affect the next best guess of the system. That whole process of allocating precision to signals has been associated with how we pay attention, how the brain pays attention. More informally, it's an active modulation of this sort of signal to noise ratio, the gain that sensory signals have. So just in visual attention, if I covertly pay attention to something there, it would be like my brain is now up weighting those sensory signals that are more likely to influence my next perceptual take on the scene. So this provides, I think, an interesting angle into how this process might go wrong. So how, for instance, do people have visual hallucinations? Something is happening there, and there's still an ongoing debate. Is it because, let's say, somebody with schizophrenia allocates too much importance to the sensory signal so that it then has more of an impact in updating that person's perception and then belief about what is going on? So you end up in a case where their perceptual content and their beliefs of that perception diverges from somebody without that, because they've had an unusual allocation of attention. And it doesn't have to be like the conscious explicit attention that you overt attention you move around, could be something else. So that's I think one mechanism that can lead to things going awry, and could apply also to anorexia and body dysmorphias and things like that. But there may be other things going on there too, about hierarchical levels of prayers, about exactly what a change in one level means for your beliefs at another level, and so on. But as to the other question about what's deciding what is erroneous and not, now that's super interesting. I don't think it does suffer from this homuncular regress, because this whole architecture is based on the idea of having a generative model of what would the sensory signals be for a particular belief about the world. So when we dream, you can think of it as a perceptual generative model running freely. And a lot of machine learning algorithms learn to do this. They learn a reduced model of the structure of the data so that they can then generate the data. And this is a very efficient way of doing learning. So a lot of these architectures assume there's some generative model in there. Now, that's not the same as a homunculus, because it's not like some central thing that's sort of replaying an inner movie in the head. It's something that plays out across the hierarchy, all hierarchical levels. But it is also something that can be learned. So given data, you can have mechanisms that learn generative models from data.
So it's almost like we're creating synthetic data sets.
That's
and then
right.
Just recalibrating through experience.
Absolutely. So in machine learning, you have this classic distinction between supervised and unsupervised learning. And a criticism of supervised learning has always been, well, where's the supervisor? There's nobody in the brain that tells the brain, cat is in that picture, but not in that picture. But there are unsupervised ways of doing pretty much everything. And I think they have much more biological plausibility. But again, not all, because over longer timescales, you could also think of evolution as a supervisor that installs sort of hardwired teaching signals for the brain that we then use to train up our own models during development. So it's not completely implausible to think of there being supervisory signals telling you what's right and wrong, that they're just things that evolution has settled on as being reliable over much, much longer timescales. Go to the back and then to the front. Yes.
The book is fantastic.
Thank you. That's your question, right?
That's a warning because I'm a member of the general public, so I don't have specialist understanding. But thank you for making what you have accessible. And one thing intrigues me. I think I share what I understand about your skepticism and psychism. But on the other hand, towards the end of the talk, you referred to the overlap of mindware and wetware going all the way down in some sense. And you talk about that in the book at length. I wanted to ask though, if AI systems such as ChatGPT and future iterations, if they're getting better and better at mimicking processes that seem to go on in human brains and maybe elsewhere, is there, maybe this is a very poorly framed question, in which case tell me, but is there some necessary, in your view, is there some necessarily insurmountable barrier for machines to approach something like consciousness?
So the boring answer is I don't know. The intuition is that it depends what kind of machine. And that there's this long-running debate about whether the substrate matters. The common view, at least most recently, has been that it doesn't, because why should it? If you can do everything functionally that the brain is doing in a system made out of silicon or pieces of string, then why should it matter that we're made out of carbon and have biological-based neurons? So, but you could equally ask, well, why should it not matter? I mean, there are some things for which the substrate doesn't matter. Like you imagine computer simulation playing chess. It's still playing chess. It doesn't matter that it's doing it through a different mechanism. But a computer simulation of the weather, it never actually gets wet and windy. It's always a simulation, right? So what's consciousness more like, playing chess or the weather? It kind of depends on your prior philosophical assumptions about this. I tend towards the idea that the substrate might matter, precisely because it's very hard even to identify what is the substrate and what is not in a living system if it's continuous all the way down. It doesn't mean that everything that is alive is conscious.
It doesn't mean that panpsychism is necessarily true.
No. And actually that would be called biopsychism. So there's this idea of biopsychism, which is that everything alive is conscious. That would be the sort of slightly more restricted version, but taking the extreme of what I've been saying, which I'm not going that far. And then there's also biological naturalism, which says that only living things can be conscious. I have a bit more sympathy with that. And then there's what I've been saying, which is even weaker, which is sort of a pragmatic biological naturalism, that we can only understand consciousness by understanding our nature as living systems. But to point directly, given the increase in things like GPT, whatever, I think what's likely to happen is we're going to get to a point where, independently of whether the thing actually is conscious, and probably isn't, it will give us the strong cognitively impenetrable impression that it is, in the same way that some of those visual illusions, like the Mudaliar illusion, you cannot see through it. the lines will always look different lengths, even though you know they're the same. And this is what I worry about a bit. We'll get to a stage where whatever you know about the underlying mechanism, that it's just a bunch of lookup tables, it will give you the impression that there's a conscious mind there. And that's going to be a very socially challenging situation for us to be in. We're very gullible like that as a species.
Excellent talk. Thank you so much. I was curious to get your opinions on the binding problem. This question of why is consciousness unified? Why is my tasting, my smelling, my touching, my thinking about a piece of chocolate all wrapped up in a single unified conscious experience?
Okay, so the binding problem is slightly different, right? So the binding problem would be mainly about objects. So how is it that my brain puts together the colors and the shapes so that mauve chair is experienced as a thing? I think that many very satisfactory solutions to that, based on synchrony and so on. The conscious unity problem about why is that chair part of an overall unified scene is more complex. One of the things I worry about is that it's often taken as sort of axiomatic that that's how consciousness is. IIT certainly does that. But it's interesting to consider, is that justified? Tim Bain, again, one of my colleagues, has often written about this too. It's like, why do we assume that consciousness is always unified, from our own parochial perspective? So I worry, is it a failure of imagination to assume that consciousness is always like this or not? I don't have a good answer to that, but I worry about it a bit. But given as a working assumption that it is, or at least it seems to be, from our phenomenological data points that we have, then I think the idea is, as I was sort of sketching in the first part of the talk, to come up with measures that accommodate an overall unity with sort of intrinsic variations within each state. That, from a sort of first superficial phenomenology, that's what conscious experiences are like. They have a unity, but it's not homogeneous. There's variation within. And accommodating both things at once is, in a way that has purchase on empirical data, I think is the key. And it's what theories like IIT are trying to do, and what in a more limited, but hopefully closer to empirical data, the work that we're trying to do with measures of emergence and so on. Yes.
There's a question online if Jakub can unmute himself.
Yes, thank you.
You may need to turn your sound.
Yeah.
Does that work?
Can you get later?
Dreamachines, right?
Is it working now?
I don't mind, so that we're getting feedback.
Yeah, a bit of
Or do you want to just read it out?
He hasn't written it.
Oh, okay.
He has
yeah.
his hand raised, that's why.
I'm in person. But so what would you suggest me to do? Do you want me to
Well, the technology is a word for something.
Gonna message him.
Okay. While we saw that, should I take another in-the-room question? We figure out how to do the Zoom questions. Yes, please.
I'm just wondering, speaking about kind of a unified model, I was wondering if you can extrapolate from your models to like the collective level, collective consciousness, and whether you found any kind of existence of such a collective kind of mind.
So can I just push a little bit more on what you mean by that concept of collective
Rather
consciousness?
than at the individual level, whether there is some connectivity between minds and between lived experiences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, well, yes, but I think there's two meanings to this. That's why I'm a little bit cautious about it, because I think there's an almost trivial sense in which our individual experiences are heavily shaped by our collective social environment. And our minds are partly refracted through the minds of others. And this seems to be fairly clear. So you can think of this sense of my inference about other people's minds providing a source of expectation on my own experiences. So it's another part of the whole predictive processing story. But within that story, there's nothing particularly mysterious going on. It's the experience that's happening is still happening within an individual organism. The other meaning that's sometimes put out there is that there is an experience which somehow kind of supervenes on a bunch of individuals, that that a bunch of people collectively are having an experience, not just everybody within it having an experience, which is somewhat similar. Now, I don't find this an appealing way to think. I don't know how one would test it. I don't see any evidence that this happens or any particular need to postulate that it does happen to account for the data about consciousness that we do have. But this is not to deny the importance of social networks and social connections that fundamentally shape all our experiences and do so in a very culturally variable way. And this is one thing with the perception census we want to get some handle on. Like, how do different cultures experience themselves and the world in a way that we can link to psychophysics data as well, rather than just sort of at the anthropological level. Yes.
You said something along the lines of we are all neurodiverse, and that we have different experiences. And yet it seems that the arts have congregated around ways in which we are similar. It's a sort of poetry of prediction, backing our. We may like different music and different magicians and comedians, yet we all seem to like these activities. So I'm interested in what is universal about our experiences and our consciousness.
What's universal about art experience as well? And I'm really out of my wheelhouse, but I think there's some things to say. I mean, I was very struck a few years ago reading basic stuff about art history, about this concept called the beholder's share from Ernst Gombrich back in the mid-20th century. It's basically saying the same thing as predictive view of perception. It's the part of an encounter with an artwork that's brought by the beholder of the artwork. It's not in the artwork itself.
We seem to enjoy. You and I may enjoy the same piece of art.
We may. I mean, I don't know whether that's going to be how universal that is, but thinking about, like, in music, for instance, there are some things that seem to work like resolutions of cadences, right? But they work more in certain musical traditions than others. In my family's Indian, very different musical tradition now, where other things might have that's an equivalent aesthetic appeal because the whole tonal scale is slightly different. So there may be a common principle at work, which is resolution of expected unexpectedness. Like, we all know when a cadence is coming, and then it resolves and we feel good. So there's a sort of predicted unpredictability about
Tension
that.
and release, sort of general.
And that might apply in a different way for a different musical tradition. And in the same way in visual arts, like, there's something about, for me, impressionist art that's really, really appealing, because it's sort of a very, in a way, culturally invariant play on how the visual system works. An impressionist artist is painting not objects, but the raw materials on which visual perception gets to work. I mean, that's what's so amazing about the skill of impressionist artists. They're able to reverse engineer how the visual system works to paint light. And I think that's beautiful. And being not an expert viewer of art, I mean, I enjoy that because I don't need to know about the sort of the whole cultural tradition in which impressionist art emerged in order to enjoy it, in the same way I might need to do to enjoy some more abstract forms of art that have their salience because of the time and place that they appeared. So yeah, I think it'd be a case of general principles that play out in different ways in different cultures. Have you got it? Yeah, okay.
I have it. So Yakub asks, you have talked about levels and contents of consciousness and their perspectives in terms of complexity, science, and predictive processing. Would you give us your best take on how they can be synthesized together, if at all?
Oh.
You've sort of hinted on this problem in the talk.
Yeah. I mean, it's a problem. I mean, that I've tended to keep them separate. I know Pedro thinking about this as well. You know, there are ways in which you can think of are quantities like, I mean, to speculate. What would you say about this, Pedro? How would you put the two together?
What I would say is that individual neurons are themselves pretty dumb. I think that's a fair assumption as far as intelligent systems go. Now, brains are actually really smart. So if you want to, put them together, if a bunch of neurons need to make predictions together, because that's what they do, which is predict stuff, they need to engage in complex ways together. So these ideas of prediction and complexity come because complexity is necessary for prediction in a distributed system made of weak learners. And this is all very hand-wavy, and I have no idea how to do the maths about this. If anyone has any idea, I would love to hear more about it, but that's, you know, roughly where I would kind of lean towards.
Yeah. I think there are other things that, you know, again, with equal speculation, you can say about whether, you know, in the predictive brain thing, you've got quantities like free energy, you know, how those might relate to other things that you might define in terms of complexity. So does minimizing, you know, minimizing some quantity like free energy give you something that has some intrinsic level of complexity at the end of it? It's not clear, which if anyone has the only attempts that I've seen so far that try and put it together have not been very compelling to me. It's been more like, okay, these things are important, so let's lump them together, and then we get a bigger theory, but not a more parsimonious theory. So yes, don't have a satisfactory answer to that. Good question. Yes.
I was wondering what kind of credence you give to the idea of expert phenomenologists. There's some talk about people who are very good or are better than the general population at describing their phenomenal experience.
Yeah.
This can be, you know, either people who have kind of some kind of phenomenological training, like Buddhism or Heideggerian phenomenology, or people who have, you know, been through very intense psychedelic states very often, and so on. And what role, if any, do these people have in a science of consciousness?
Yes, excellent question. I think an important role. But I don't think it has to be only those people that you mentioned. Like when psychology started in the late 19th century in Leipzig and Dondas and wherever, people were being trained to be phenomenologists. I mean, that was part of the whole thing. Like, it had to be explained to them what it means to report in a psychophysics experiment, and we still have to do that. You know, we typically train people in an experiment like this is what it means to report something, but it's often done in a very constrained way. It's usually done from like, don't mess my experiment up. This is what I mean when I say this. But it could be done in a more expansive way to have people pay more attention to the way their experience unfolds. You know, whether that's through meditation or through widening the range of experiences one has. And we've done some experiments with synesthesia and this sort of mixing of the senses. And part of that involved second person interviews where you guide people through without leading them to report in any particular direction, to pay attention to what's actually going on for them. And you find out that there's more to people's experience of synesthesia than they typically had reported before, when they just thought, oh, it's mixing of the senses, so I see, you know, the letter X as being green, and that's that. And so this whole project of computational neurophenomenology that I'm invested in now, it's on both sides. It's about developing explanatory, potent computational architectures, but also being more sophisticated about what it is we're trying to explain. And this is where traditional psychophysics falls short, because it's, you know, were the dots moving left or right? Was there a face? Was there not a face? That does not do justice to the kinds of questions that, if we answer them, will then, in my view, help dissolve the hard problem.
Do you think that the predictive processing machinery of an expert phenomenologist is working somewhat differently, or is it something about reporting and describing that happens kind of after the perceptual?
So that's also an excellent question. So I was a co-author on a paper with Maxwell Ramstad and others, which had a slightly different take on computational phenomenology, which was exactly that, how one models the phenomenological act itself as an aspect of predictive coding, of predictive processing. And I think there is something to be said about that too. I think there are resources there, whether they're satisfactory or not, I don't know. I'm not well versed enough in philosophical phenomenology to know, but I'm confident that that's a productive approach to take.
Okay, I think we'll have coffee and tea now. There'll still be opportunities to speak to Anil. I want to thank you again for giving this amazing talk. I think where you ended up, of course, is about the richness of the things that comes to our brains. And of course, one of the things we're very interested in the center is why is that some of those leads to flourishing. And I think that could potentially be one of the things we should discuss as we have something flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you.